Welcome to the 2022-2023 Random Validation Process Training on Unsafe School Choice Option Program Requirements Overview. My name is Idalia Ibanez, USCO Director at the Texas Education Agency. First, we would like to share some things to keep in mind regarding this random validation process. Please note that documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and be available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. Another thing to note is that to ensure overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. In addition, keep in mind that the documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. If meeting documentation is to be provided for any requirement, please consider the following. The standard meeting documentation that an LEA should maintain locally includes meeting agendas, meeting notes or minutes, and sign-in sheets. Please note that documentation for virtual meetings is an acceptable form of documentation. Given the increased use of virtual meeting environments, participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and stakeholder names and roles would be acceptable substitutes for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need of a participant signature. Now let's take a look at the 2022-2023 random validation process for unsafe school choice option, which is a USCO policy requirement. Now let's talk specifically about the unsafe school choice option program requirement. USCO policy. The LEA, as a condition of receiving funds under the Every Student Succeeds Act, must establish and implement a policy requiring that a student attending a persistently dangerous public elementary school or secondary school, as determined by the Texas Education Agency, or a student who becomes a victim of a violent criminal offense while in or on the grounds of a public elementary or secondary school that the student attends, is offered and allowed to attend a safe public elementary or secondary school within the local educational agency, including a public charter school. Please note, if another campus is not available within the LEA, the policy should provide for other types of services to ensure the safety of the student. In addition, the LEA is encouraged to attempt to secure a cooperative agreement with another LEA to accept transfers when reasonable and appropriate. The required documentation for this USCO requirement includes a copy of the policy approved as per LEA policies and procedures. The acceptable documentation is a copy of the policy. Furthermore, acceptable documentation, the policy should include the following: timelines and procedures under which parents are offered transfers, generally within 14 days of the incident. Timelines and procedures for processing and approving transfer requests within 14 calendar days of the date of the request for transfer is made known to the LEA. A description of the duration for which a transfer is approved and procedures for renewal of transfer. A statement of assurance that collection and maintenance of victim data information, for example, incident date, incident number, and identity of the perpetrator, if known, will be maintained for a minimum of 5 years for auditing and validation monitoring purposes. A statement of assurance that the LEA will collect and maintain documentation to show that victims' parents were offered the USCO transfer option, and a statement of assurance that documentation will be maintained reflecting when a transfer was requested and completed. Again, the documentation required for Unsafe School Choice Option USCO Policy includes a copy of the policy approved as per LEA's policies and procedures. Now, what are some issues that may result in an improvement needed status for this requirement? This could include auditable documentation requested was not submitted, documentation that does not include what is included in the USCO policy requirements, or documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation. Another documentation required as part of the USCO policy is documentation that any student who has been affected by either of the circumstances mentioned in the USCO policy requirement has been offered the opportunity to transfer if applicable. The acceptable documentation includes a copy of written notification procedure, letters to parents of any student who has been affected by either of these circumstances, documenting the offer of opportunity to transfer. If not applicable, the LEA assures that the following reason applies. The LEA had no campuses identified as persistently dangerous schools, and the LEA had no students who were victims of violent crime. A statement including this language will suffice as documentation. Again, another required documentation as part of the USCO policy requirement is documentation that any student who has been affected by either of the circumstances mentioned in the USCO policy requirements has been offered the opportunity to transfer, if applicable. What are some issues that may result in an improvement needed status for this requirement? This could include auditable documentation requested was not submitted, documentation that does not include what is included in the USCO policy requirements, documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation. These are the requirements for the Unsafe School Choice option as it relates to the USCO policy. Here's our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.